I woke up to the most revolting stench I had ever experienced in my entire life. Two emaciated women were desperately clawing at the few rags I had left on my body. As I looked around, my blood went cold at the sight of skeletons being chewed by stray dogs in a nearby ditch. I realized I was starving, my stomach twisting with a pain that made it hard to even breathe. The monks at the temple line turned me away because I didn't even have a bowl to hold their thin porridge. A city guard blocked my path with a spear, mocking my short hair and calling me a common beggar. Suddenly, a sharp pain lanced through my skull, and a strange, cold voice echoed in the back of my mind. A mysterious system had bonded to me, offering the power to summon an armored rider and a daily sign-in reward. My first sign-in granted me 10 tons of pristine white rice stored in a pocket dimension I could access at will. I sat on a stone by the water, realizing I was likely in the city of Liang during the chaotic 5 Dynasties era. To test the system, I materialized a 50-kilogram bag of rice, watching it hit the rock with a satisfying thud. I ripped the bag open and began to eat the raw grains, finding them crunchy and strangely sweet. I calculated the dynasties on my fingers, wondering exactly which emperor ruled this unstable land. Thousands of mosquitoes swarmed me, their bites becoming an unbearable torture in the humid night air. I activated the system's symbiosis power, sharing the summoned knight's defense until my skin became as hard as iron. I stood and laughed like a madman as the insects swarmed me in vain, unable to pierce my skin. The 50-kilogram bag of rice felt as light as a pillow when I lifted it with a single hand. I summoned a Tang-style blade, its edge gleaming beautifully under the cold light of the moon. The moment my fingers gripped the hilt, ancient fighting techniques flooded into my body like a rushing tide. A small black crossbow punched a bolt clean through a tree trunk, cracking the solid rock behind it. I had to decide whether to become a powerful outlaw or infiltrate the city to live in comfort. As I dozed off using the rice sack as a pillow, the sound of quiet footsteps on gravel alerted my sharpened senses. 2 men whispered about my unusual clothes, deciding to kill me for what they thought was hidden wealth. I rolled away just as a stick smashed into the rice sack, precisely where my head had been moments before. With a thought, I summoned the black warhorse and its armored rider from the void of the system. The rider swung the flat of his blade, sending both men flying into the dirt with bone-crushing force. After tying them up, I discovered they were human traffickers who sold children into a life of misery. They revealed that I had arrived in the 7th year of Tianfu, just as the Khitan invasion was about to begin. I told them they were free to go, but as they ran, I raised my crossbow and ended their lives without a second thought. My hands shook as I stared at the river, coming to terms with the fact that I had just killed 2 men. I told myself they were traffickers who deserved no mercy, repeating the words until my pulse finally slowed. I had the rider dispose of the bodies in the deep water, watching as they vanished beneath the current. The next morning, I cleaned my mud-caked shoes and prepared to approach the city gates once again. I carried the massive rice sack back toward the gates, my easy strength drawing the eyes of every starving refugee. A group of thugs led by a man with a scarred face surrounded me, demanding that I share the rice. My body moved with the grace of a master as I dodged the leader's rush and neutralized him with a single, brutal punch. I told the remaining survivors they could eat, but they would have to follow my orders from that day forward. A minor official named Jiang Wu approached me, intrigued by the quality of the rice I possessed. I handed the official half a bag of rice, and in exchange he agreed to vouch for me as a merchant from the south. As I stepped through the cool shadow of the gate tunnel, I left the cries of the refugees behind me and entered the city of Liang. The bustling streets of Liang stretched before me like a golden web of opportunity and hidden dangers. I needed a secure location where my system summons wouldn't attract the prying eyes of the city guard. My first order of business was to acquire a neglected warehouse on the edge of the southern district near the canal. Using a handful of the silver coins generated by my sign-in system, I purchased the deed from a desperate, indebted landlord. With the property secured, I returned to the refugee gates under the cover of dusk to find manpower. I scanned the faces of the desperate men and women, looking for those with eyes that still held a spark of defiance. I approached a group of 5 sturdy youths who had been protecting an elderly woman from a band of petty thieves. I offered them more than just food. I offered them a purpose and a roof over their heads in exchange for absolute loyalty. They followed me back into the city, their eyes widening as we entered the spacious, albeit dusty, warehouse. Once the doors were barred, I triggered the system to summon 2 ironclad guards to stand watch over the entrance. My new followers fell to their knees in terror, mistaking the summons for divine Mohist sorcery. I told them to rise, explaining that as long as they served me, these guardians would be their protectors. By the next morning, the warehouse had been transformed into a living space and a preliminary storefront. I accessed my inventory and withdrew 10 sacks of snow white, refined sugar, a rarity in this era. I also produced high-grade fine salt, lacking the bitter impurities common in the local market. To attract the right attention, I sent my most articulate recruit, a former clerk named Zhang, to the Golden Crane Tea House. He carried a small sample of the sugar intended for the eyes of Manager Wang, a man known for his ties to the local nobility. Within 2 hours, a lavish carriage pulled up to the front of my unassuming warehouse. Manager Wang stepped out, his eyes darting around the warehouse with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. I greeted him with the measured politeness of a merchant who knew the true value of his cargo. When I showed him the contents of the sacks, his skepticism vanished, replaced by a glint of pure avarice. He offered a price that would have been a fortune to any commoner, but I simply shook my head and doubled it. To my satisfaction, he agreed immediately, desperate to secure a monopoly on such high-quality goods. As the carriage departed with the first shipment, I noticed 2 figures lingering in the shadows of an alleyway across the street. They weren't common thugs. Their posture and the way they tracked the carriage suggested they were professional scouts. I knew that my sudden entry into the market would ruffle the feathers of the established Great Harmony trading house. Instead of hiding, I decided to lure them in and send a message that would resonate with their masters. I left the side door to the warehouse partially unbolted and instructed my recruits to sleep in the back room. Hours later, the silence of the night was broken by the faint, rhythmic creak of floorboards. The 2 spies crept through the darkness, their daggers drawn and reflecting the moonlight. Suddenly, the air turned cold as my ironclad guards stepped out from behind the pillars. The spies froze, their weapons trembling in their hands as they faced the immovable walls of black steel. I stepped out from the shadows, leaning against a crate of salt with a bored expression. I asked them if the Great Harmony Trading House usually sent such incompetent thieves to handle their negotiations. One spy lunged at me in a final act of desperation, but a massive gauntlet caught him by the throat midair. The sickening sound of snapping bone echoed through the empty hall as the guard ended the man's life without hesitation. I turned to the second spy, who was now sobbing on the floor, and told him he had a job to do. I handed him a small pouch of the refined salt and told him to deliver it to his master with a warning. I told him that if they ever stepped onto my property again, the next delivery would be their heads in a crate. The spy scrambled out of the warehouse, disappearing into the night as fast as his legs could carry him. By morning, the story of the ghost merchants and their invincible guardians began to spread through the underworld. My influence was growing, and with the gold from Manager Wang, I could now begin the next phase of my expansion. I planned to move toward the marshes, a place where I could build a permanent stronghold away from the city's jurisdiction. However, a messenger arrived later that day, bearing an invitation that I hadn't anticipated. The seal on the scroll belonged to the city governor, a man known for his ruthless suppression of any independent power. Why would a high-ranking official take interest in a mere merchant so quickly? As I read the letter, my blood ran cold at the final line, "We know where you really came from." The secret of my arrival, something I thought was buried with the refugees, was somehow compromised. Outside, the sound of heavy boots marching in unison began to echo from the end of the street. I realized then that my rise to power had not only attracted rivals, but had put me directly in the crosshairs of a hunt I wasn't prepared for. The shadows of the trading house spies I had eliminated still seemed to linger in the corners of my mind. I knew that being a target meant I was finally playing the game at a level that mattered. Outside, the streets of Bian Liang were vibrating with a new frantic energy as rumors of war spread. The local government's response was predictable, as they levied a defense tax that stripped the poor of their last copper coins. This instability was not a hurdle for me, but rather the perfect smokescreen for my final expansion. I gathered my inner circle of loyal refugees in the dead of night to reveal the next phase of our operation. I told them we were moving our primary production to the Great Black Marshes where no tax collector would dare tread. My system had granted me the blueprints for a reinforced industrial mill that looked like something out of a Mohist legend. To protect this site, I deployed a full squad of Shadow Knights to patrol the perimeter. Any bandit or scout who wandered too close simply vanished into the reeds without a sound. Meanwhile, back in Beyond Liang, I sat in the finest tea house and watched the elite panic over the rising price of grain. They didn't realize that I was the one controlling the supply, slowly siphoning their gold into my vaults. The sign-in system rang in my ears, announcing that my wealth had reached the threshold for a palace-grade upgrade. Suddenly, the dilapidated manor I had purchased began to reconstruct itself through the power of the system. The old wood was replaced by polished ebony, and the gardens bloomed with flowers that shouldn't exist in this season. My followers looked at me not just as a master, but as a living god of the Mohist arts. I called my lead lieutenant, a former beggar named Chen, to the private inner sanctum. I showed him a modern mechanical lathe I had summoned, explaining it as a heavenly loom for crafting steel. Chen's eyes nearly fell out of his head as he watched the machine shave metal with impossible precision. I told him that this technology was our greatest secret, and that the penalty for betrayal was eternal silence. News arrived that the Kitten army had finally breached the northern pass, sending the city into a total tailspin. While others packed their carts to flee, I sat in my garden and opened a bottle of wine from my system storage. I had already purchased the loyalty of the city's garrison commander with a crate of immortal medicine, modern antibiotics. He now viewed me as his only hope for survival, and his 3,000 soldiers were effectively mine. The Kitten vanguard reached the outskirts of my marsh facility, thinking it was an easy target for pillaging. I gave the order through my mental link, and the Shadow Knights emerged from the water like vengeful spirits. The Khitan horses screamed in terror as the silent giants cut through their ranks with mechanical efficiency. It wasn't a battle, it was a systematic harvest of those who dared to touch my property. By the time the sun set, the threat to my production facility had been completely erased. I realized that the old world was dying, and I was the architect of the new one rising from its ashes. I opened my granaries to the local refugees, ensuring they knew that it was the House of Li that fed them, not the Emperor. They began to chant my name, a sound that carried more power than any official title ever could. The corrupt officials who had once tried to squeeze me now came to my door to beg for protection. I let them wait for hours in the sun, making them understand exactly where they stood in the new hierarchy. When I finally granted them an audience, I sat on a throne of modern ergonomic design that confused and intimidated them. I informed them that Bian Liang was now under my protection, and my word was the only law that mattered. The Khitan invasion was eventually repelled by the garrison, but only because I provided the steel and the strategy. My empire of scarcity had become an empire of abundance, all managed by the silent ticking of the system. I looked at the modern watch on my wrist, a small reminder of the world I left behind. I had entered this world as a starving refugee, but I would rule it as the shadow merchant, the master of all things.